All right, we are going to get started. We've got 2 more presentations. These have been awesome so far, and our next one up has been a group that has been very close to my table and my heart. This is the bioengineered food label study.
Yeah. My name's Sophie Kelmanson. I'm a PhD student at UNC Chapel Hill in the Department of City and Regional Planning.
I'm guessing, yeah, this works, doesn't it? And I'm Samantha Mosier. You know me as Sam, and I'm at East Carolina University as an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. So as you can see, we're not very creative with titles. So we're going to be talking about bioengineered food label, this is the label that will be actually showing up on food packages starting in 2020. So to give you some topic background, both of us are really into food policy, like a lot. So when we did the most similar groups, as you might remember, there was a dyad, that was us. And so we are focusing on GMO labeling. So in 2016, Congress actually adopted a bill saying, guess what? Coming soon to a market near you will be a food product that will actually be labeled as bioengineered or otherwise known as genetically modified organisms. In 2018, so last year, the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service actually developed a proposed rule, and this was actually finalized in December of 2018. So this whole process deals with rulemaking. It is one form of policymaking that specifically focuses on the bureaucracy. Now, as a note, I'm probably going to use the term GMO more often than genetically engineered or even bioengineered. Simply because GMOs are the most commonly used reference to talk about genetically modified materials that may show up in your food and our food supply. So I'm going to flip between the two, but bioengineered is the appropriate term, and it's what actually our labels will be like in 2020. All right, so who cares? Who cares about a label, and why are we doing a study? So to give you some background, there are some eco labels like organic, natural, non-GMO, fair trade certified, etc., so forth and so on. These are value-added labels. They cost a lot of money when you go to shop for them. So for example, a study that kind of came out and some assessments of current market information says if you buy fair trade certified products, on average, you are paying 30% more for that item. It varies. So if you buy organic, this can be anywhere from 5% premium up to 30 to 40%. For some people, this is a lot of money. The average consumer, the normal folks of the world, can't necessarily afford this. So we consider GMO labeling kind of a no premium service to those that can afford some of these actual higher price point products. In an estimation, we have 75% of products on your normal grocery store shelf. So think about your Walmarts, your Food Lions, not necessarily your Whole Food markets, actually are going to contain those genetically modified materials in them. So this comes back around that if we are dealing with policy, we are concerned about policy responsiveness and representation as a whole. Most of the American public wants our food to be labeled if it actually has a GMO in it. Estimations range somewhere between 70 to 95%, depending on which study you're looking at. And so an underlying question to all of this, and not to bore you with theory, is the public will actually represented in our policy outcomes? And this is not just what happens in Congress, but also what occurs during our rulemaking process. So we started at a different point, I guess, in some groups. We had this very theoretical question, and we narrowed it down into something practical. Our data actually comes from the Federal Register. There's 2 ways to access this information. You can go through regulations.gov, or you can go to the federalregister.gov. Both of them contain proposed and final rules, in addition to a number of other documents that are released through this particular publication. They do have APIs. So if you are interested in working with government information, you can go to data.gov, request an API key, but it does not work on regulations.gov. So Sophie found out that if you request API access key to regulations.gov, they only do this on Fridays. So
I got mine today.
She got hers today. Last week I requested mine. I had a data.gov API key, and I had to email the folks at regulations.gov to get access because they have to verify it. So there is a bit of a lag in being able to get to that. We also discovered that they say there is a 1,000 documents per hour rate limit. That is also a lie, at least when we did it. So after some disasters and looping and trying to pull the comments that are associated with this particular proposed rule, we found out that we could pull all 14,019 submissions within a grand total of, I think, less than 5 minutes, which was wonderful because the looping actually failed the way I originally intended. So if you stay in a hotel and you're trying to loop, they will boot you off in the middle of the night and not tell you. So 14,000 comments. This occurred both during the open comment period. I'll talk about that here in a second, and even after the comment period had closed. Now, for reference, if you're not familiar with rulemaking, only those comments that typically or that do come in during your open comment period are actually read by the agency. Anything that comes in after it is completely disregarded, but we included all of that information here to kind of try to get a feel about what's going on. So our task for this particular institute, since we are a 2-woman group, we didn't get too terribly far, like some of you managed to, which was super awesome. So we were really just trying to kind of examine the content and the context of the proposed rule commentary. So this required a lot of cleaning, a lot of exploration without going into fancy visuals, and analyzing comment text, which I'm gonna let Sophie talk about the frustrations with that. In the future, we do plan on continuing this work with some of the activities listed here at the bottom, including a comparative evaluation of the proposed rule, the commentary and the final language that came out in the final rule, and really seeing how that public input is incorporated into it, because this was a last-ditch attempt for people to actually voice their concerns and the policy to be modified accordingly. We also have hopes to eventually do some newspaper coverage of the GMO debate and compare it to the people that commented on this rule. We had a number of issues with the data. I got 6 points for you. There were some duplicates. So just because it was a submission does not mean that it was a unique commenter. So there are some individuals that I didn't know if my last submission went through, because there are problems with regulations.gov and the Federal Register in general. So sometimes we would see the exact same comment posted twice. There were also revision submissions. These were often more common with organizations that were representing particular trade associations. And then there were the people of, I didn't know I already did that. So they would repeatedly come back to the system, maybe after a week, and post the exact same comments. It's almost like they forgot that they did it. There were also the hyperactive folks. So these people also came back to the website and posted multiple comments with different contexts. So they walked away from it, they thought about it some more, maybe got very upset, and then commented again with something else. And so that posed an issue as you're looking at the same person posting multiple times. But perhaps the most difficult challenge was dealing with the PDFs, the docs, and the other attachments. There is the opportunity that when you are posting your commentary to register, the Federal Register, you can actually do it as an attachment. I actually commented on this rule, and I'm one of those people that did it. So I kind of shot myself in the foot with this own project, because then I had to go and pull my own PDF and put it into the data set. So only about 4% of these actual submissions had attachments. Most of them were done by individuals that come to this point of being very long-winded. So there was one comment that was 52 pages long. We found the limit of a cell within your Excel sheet. We found that limit very quickly dealing with that PDF. Also pulling the PDFs and docs off of these, we ended up hiring MTurk workers to go through and pull those for us, which was an experience in and of itself. Some of them, I did not think about it, actually contained images. There was one handwritten note. So I got a lovely message from somebody at 9:30 at night asking what to do in those cases. And so these long-winded statements were kind of a pain to deal with and crashed a computer a couple times. Woohoo! There were also some pretty weird comments in there. I think one of our favorite ones was a Jabberwocky poem. Yes, and we intentionally kept that in. So if anybody, I have it, if you have a lit minor or a lit degree, you know that when we're talking about literature, things like the Jabberwocky poem actually have meaning behind it. Maybe not direct meaning for a GMO label, but it's a nonsensical structured poem, and it's supposed to be nonsense, and it kind of makes sense if you read their comments a little bit further. The other problem with their data is we didn't know who was who. So when you go through and post something, you have to dig to figure out who is actually submitting the comment. Is it an individual? So farmers did it, consumers did it. There were a lot of trade associations that were highly influential, interest groups, and then we had a series of government officials and actual governments. So the European Union submitted comments in addition to Canada. So Canada, I think it was the official something of Canada, submitted it. We also had a number of senators and Congress members that, despite voting on the original bill which authorized that, this particular rulemaking, decided to come back and get us once again with their views and beliefs. So it was fun just wrangling in the data to try to figure out what we were doing. So because I'm not exactly the most skilled person in R, but I mastered ggplot2, I feel like it, I came up with this lovely stack chart or step chart. What this is showing you is that over time, the number of submissions that came in per day. Our particular time period actually starts here in the middle of May. The last official date for commentary was July 3rd, but you can see in July 4th, there were some comments submitted. And then even down here further, it's not going to show up very well. There were even some additional comments. Now, this by itself, I think it was beautiful, quite frankly. I celebrated, I patted myself on the back for being able to do this. And then, and then I got creative and I was like, well, let's go by type of commenter. So while Sophie was trying to deal with the disaster that was topic modeling and crashing the computer, I sat down and I had the joy of going through the data to try to figure out who was submitting commentary. So we broke it into 3 different groups. The red here on the screen are individuals, so people who are speaking for themselves. We had interest groups. This will also include trade associations and a number of other organizations, so representatives. And then government agency or just general government officials are going to be coded as 2 there in the blue. So over time, we can see a majority of the comments come from actual citizens and individuals rather than interest groups and government agencies. Based on some previous research I had done prior to coming here, and we talked about this also, we know for a fact that the general public's will was not represented very well, particularly in the federal bill. That's a whole nother discussion. And for here down at the end, I know you can't see those colors. Those are government officials. It was usually one of those things where they came back and said, by the way, we still disagree with the way you're doing things. And they were particularly attacking Sonny Perdue in those comments. So this is the point I handed off.
So despite a lot of information that I'm sure made you all very curious about, this debate, similar to the Jabberwocky poem, our results are nonsensical. But we were able to do some basic topic modeling, and I'll tell you that the data wrangling that we had to do, which was pretty extensive, we ended up not being able to analyze a lot of the content that we worked so hard to bring in, mostly because my computer just couldn't run models on 14,000 observations, particularly when some of the comments were really long, while others were quite short. We think that was part of it. This is the best image that we can show you. And you'll see that there's still a fair amount of overlap amongst the topics in terms of the most popular words. And at least for me, a lot of these words, they make sense within, the discussion about the policy, but it's kind of hard to clump them together in unique ways, or we had a little bit of a challenge making sense of whether these were truly unique topics or not. With the exception of topic 3, you can see something I thought was interesting was topic 3. The beta values are on the x-axis, and so this is the per topic, per word probability. And so the way I tried to think about it was a 0.06 being the maximum that a word is contributing means that cluster might be like slightly more cohesive, and it might be a more meaningful cluster than one with a smaller beta value. So topic 3 seemed a little more compelling from that perspective, and also the words were a bit more unique. And when we looked at some of the samples from this, or when Sam did, we realized that part of the reason it was such a cohesive topic is because it was one of those like form letters that people can sign, and an organization will submit on behalf of whoever signed their name at the bottom. And so that's kind of interesting from a research design perspective, because we have talked a lot, and I think we'll continue to talk a lot about how you evaluate where interest groups are influencing a proposed and final rule. And so we think that there's a lot of language already embedded in a proposed rule from interest groups, but then when they're really mobilizing people with their own language in the public comments as well, it sort of raises some questions about how you might code those comments. So that's kind of interesting, and I don't know, I was excited about that idea. And then 5, we think, is mostly from the PDFs, so would also be interest group participation. And we think that because, as you can see, AU and some of the other words in that topic were sort of like gibberish that the M-Turkers pulled from the PDFs. So it was kind of an accidental indicator variable, which was kind of interesting. And then I'm actually, let's see, the topic 2, we think people were complaining about the fact that some groups were proposing like a QR code that you could scan to find out if the food had GMOs in it. And people were basically saying, well, like, I don't want to bring my smartphone to the grocery store. That's too much work. I'm not going to do that. We don't think that's fair. So you can see some of the, sort of debates playing out in these topics, but it takes quite a bit of reading into the topics and making some pretty big guesses about what we think that means. For the sake of time, I won't talk too much about the other ones unless you think I'm leaving something out. Okay. So this is the rest of our presentation, more or less. And yeah, so we ran into some memory issues, and so we ended up, I kind of sliced and diced a couple different ways, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit just so that maybe this will be helpful for you guys. Yeah, so we wanted to do a TextNet analysis because we thought it would be interesting to compare if we made each comment a node and we made the edges between them common language, you could start to group nodes by contributor. So is it an interest group? Is it a government official? And then eventually compare that to the proposed and final rule and potentially see language connections, both grouping amongst each other and then also in sort of the final documents. But that didn't work, and I still think it could. So I cut out all of the PDFs that we had worked so hard to sort of collect because they were really, really long. And then I also took random samples of the public comments and then random samples of the interest groups. There weren't that many government comments, so I kept all of those in. And I did that at a couple different size samples. And the last time it actually did run, but I will spare you the graphic that it resulted. It was just too many nodes, basically. And if anyone here has done social network analysis before, like there's a lot of wrangling that goes into making the nodes like the right distance apart and making the edges visible so that you can actually see connections. And so one thing that I'd like to do going forward that Marcus and I just talked about is maybe making the edges only on like the top 50 words or something like that, or trying to clump types of comments into more discrete bins. So you'd have like more text associated with one node. Maybe it represents a whole bunch of comments, but then you have like public comment topic number 1 or something like that. So subsetting some of the public comments. So basically the TextNet's examples, I don't know what the maximum number of nodes they included in some of those examples online, but it definitely wasn't 14,000. So that was kind of the challenge we ran into. And yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. What questions do we have?
None.
Thanks for the presentation and for your honesty. So it sounds like you've read a lot of these comments just in the process of this text wrangling. Do you have a sense of sort of what you would expect topic models to be grouping based on, or sort of based on previous theory? What do you think what words should be clumping together?
Probably ought to speak into a mic. So I have a couple lots about this. So there was, I think, a grand total of 32 questions that were proposed in the initial filing. So if you go and look up the AMS, TM, and I forget the numbers, if you go and look up that proposed rule, there's 32 questions, which is normally how proposed rules work. Answer these questions, this is what we want to know. A vast majority of these up here are only answering a handful of those questions. So when you see that large volume of individual submissions, they're not considering the grand majority of that context. So seeing things like the sugar and oil, because this was a form letter, somebody wrote it for them because they went through and read the questions and structured it in such a way where it could answer it. So that one's not surprising. What I think would be interesting is to move beyond topic modeling to answer that question more clearly. Because when you get to that 52-page PDF, and I will admit even my submission, which I didn't know where it was on my computer, or I would have entered it in myself. It's a lot more detailed, talking about the thresholds and trying to identify those connections and the expectations of it. We also wanted to do a sentiment analysis, but it's just one of those things, we ran out of time. There were some industry representatives, very few things that represent like the beet industry, which are going to do quite a bit to fight against regulations that would impede or basically allow sugar, because most of your sugar is going to have some genetic modification once it gets to the stage of being high fructose corn syrup. So you have those loopholes, right? The issue is so complex, though deep learning would be helpful.
I expected there to be many more economic words. Like I expected lobbyists, or I expected people to be like, we need GMOs for food security, and it's cheap, affordable food, and that's what people want, and that's what we need. And that's kind of, the history of U.S. food policy has been about how to make sure that we always have access to food. So I thought that would be a big part of it. And I thought I would also see a lot more like these companies are monopolies types of arguments as well. And they might be in here. I want to remove like a lot of the words that came up a lot, but given that this is the first time I've done it, I wasn't sure like kind of how to make decision criteria about removing some of these words. So I think it still might be in there.
So my question comes from, I was the assistant agricultural economist for sugar when the Monsanto lawsuit began. So do you think your analysis could change if you perhaps made it commodity specific, since the commodities have such different lobbies and such different loan structures at all? Do you think that would make a difference? Or would it even be possible to narrow it by commodity?
I will let the professor answer in a second because I bet she knows better than me. But this is also a federal law that was about all GMO labels. So I'm sure that different lobbies had perspectives on that. Like we think that the sugar and oil one was about the level of refinement of certain commodities that exempts you from having to put this label on. But that was sort of an important part of our research question because we wanted to understand who and how, who is influencing proposed rule language and final rule language and how. So if we had separated that out, we would still have wanted to bring it kind of all back together, I guess.
So you had, there were a number of commodity groups that spoke to this. You had Corn Grower Association, sugar beets. I'm trying to remember the laundry list. There was also things like the Farm Bureau, which by default is usually very supportive of biotechnology applications in agriculture. Those particular comments were the very sophisticated PDF submissions, which wouldn't necessarily be represented up here because it kept shutting down a computer. For them, in terms of whether the commodity influence is there, the answer is yes. Previous to this, looking at congressional action and even state level action, you can follow the money. And you can tell that those particular organizations were influencing the design of those bills prior to adoption and prior to the authorization of administrative rulemaking. They then came back during this process to essentially make their case again. And they're the ones that gave the specific details about those thresholds and saying we can never be 100% certain. So they probably edged us towards that direction that you don't necessarily know if you were eating a GMO. But to answer your question, commodity.
We have bees, right?
Yeah, I mean, and so there's another lawsuit going on with that right now where farmers are now actually going to get to sue their neighbors if there's cross-contamination over to organic crops, which,
that's part of the reason my question comes from, because there was a Swiss chard farmer. And I think given some of the jargon in the topic modeling and some of the words that you have specified, it seems as though perhaps it could be some of the more smaller organic farmers, particularly if you're getting Farm Bureau lobbies as well, who could be somehow writing in and weighing in on this, which, in fruits and vegetables in the U.S. is like an economic non-entity. So you would definitely see the cash crops and the lobbies of the cash crops be more prevalent.
And I will
That's great. I think that's cool that you were able to see the commodities.
I was going to say the organic farmers actually were for, I did interviews before this, organic farmers and people who like organic food and the non-GMO project certified, they think that GMO labeling is wonderful and they don't even care if it tears into their market. Because if you're an idealist, you're thinking, this is great. This is what our food system should be like. But I do enjoy the commodity folks showing up all the time because you see the same names in like every political debate, no matter where you're at.
I'm interested in how the bill changed before and after the submission of these comments. Do you have any sense for the content or perhaps a sentiment or topic model of the bill itself?
No.
I can tell you about the congressional bill quite a bit, but in terms of the rulemaking, this symbol at the very beginning, there were quite a number of comments about this. And people are not happy about it. This was, I think, one of 3 that were proposed. People are very angry with how happy and safe it makes biotechnology look. So in general, the congressional bill was considered an unhappy compromise. Republicans weren't happy. Democrats weren't happy. People just generally not happy. The rulemaking process did not make this any easier. And it's also confounded by other things that Sunny Purdue is doing, particularly to the Economic Research Service, too, in case you don't keep up with that. So.
Any other questions over there? Yes. Let me just give you the mic because we're online.
I think this is related. So, but I mean, it seems like in terms of, obviously it's policy relevant. It is policy, but like it seems like a topic model would be very helpful for them. I mean, what does one do with 13,000 submissions except what does one do with 13,000? So making sense of those seems like it would be a very helpful service to policymakers.
I would tell you the rulemaking process involves a handful of people going through all 14,000 comments and sorting them by hand. You could use these kind of applications to speed up the process, potentially, if you were working at regulations.gov and specifically for the Agricultural Marketing Service. This load is actually small compared to what they've dealt with in the past because people get very passionate about food labeling. So yeah, it's a couple people that go through all the comments.
But we're also pretty skeptical that public comments and public input changed much. Yeah, so there's also that component.
Good point. Great idea. Anyone else? Last question? Nope. All right. Well, we've got one more group to prep for. Let's give them a round of applause.
Yeah. And thank you. Should we say thank you for all our support?